January, we'll pick our story back up. This morning is going to be a little different than normal because I'm going to take a little bit different approach to the life of Joseph. I've been reading, as I've been studying for this series, I ran across a book that's been published recently. And what the guy does is he takes the Egyptian world and he takes the Hebrew world and what we know of those from archaeology and study and everything else. And then he takes the Genesis story and he combines them into a narrative. And then reading this, it has given me some tremendous insight to look at this story in a way I've never looked at this story before. So this morning, I'm going to read a tremendously large amount of Scripture. Then I'm going to basically give you a pretty close possible scenario. And then we're going to get to some applications of two things for our lives this week. So that's where we are going. Up until now, we've understood Joseph is from a very dysfunctional family. We've talked about the idea that dreams were a way back then that God communicated to him to give him hope for the future. And last week when we left him in the pit, understanding that God was still in charge in his life. So this morning what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to Genesis chapter 27, and I'm going to go all the way back in his family history to an event with his daddy, Jacob, and the story of Jacob and Esau. And I want to read that because it's going to lay the groundwork for what happens in Genesis 37 with Joseph, and you'll see that as we go through it. So hang on, here we go. Genesis 27. Now Rebekah, this would be his great-grandmother, was listening as Isaac spoke to his son Esau. This is Jacob's brother. When Esau left for the open country to hunt game and bring it back, Rebekah said to her son Jacob, "Look, I overheard your father say to your brother Esau, 'Bring me some game and prepare me some tasty food to eat so that I may give you the blessing in the presence of the Lord before I die. Now, my son, listen carefully and do what I tell you. Go out to the flock and bring me 2 choice young goats so I can prepare some tasty food for your father just the way he likes it. Then take it to your father to eat so that he may give you the blessing before he dies.' Jacob said to Rebekah, his mother, 'But my brother Esau is a hairy man, and I have smooth skin. What if my father touches me? I would appear to be tricking him, and he would bring down a curse on myself rather than a blessing.' His mother turned to him and said, 'My son, let the curse fall on me. Just do what I say. Go and get them for me.' So he went. Now, we're talking about Jacob. This would be Joseph's dad. Okay. So he went and he got them, and he brought them to his mother, and she prepared him some tasty food, just the way his father liked it. Then Rebekah took the best clothes of Esau, her older son, which she had in the house. She put them on her younger son, Jacob. He covered his hands and the smooth part of his neck with the goat skins. Then she handed to her son, Jacob, the tasty food and the bread she made." So, if you know the rest of the story, what happens is Jacob now goes in. He tricks his dad to give him the blessing. He gives the blessing to Jacob. Esau comes in, and his dad goes, "Who are you?" "I'm Esau." And he realizes he has been tricked, and he had already given away the blessing. So Esau comes to Jacob and basically says this: "The next time I see you, you are a dead man. We'll mourn Dad's death, but the second this is over, I'm killing you. You should not have done this." So his mom has to look at him, Rebekah, and say, "You have to flee, Jacob, because your brother will kill you." So in that moment, after Dad has been deceived, Dad dies, and he hightails it out of there, and then it's a long time before Jacob and Esau see each other again. Jacob goes down, has all the kids that we're talking about now, and ends up with a son, Joseph. And so now what you're going to see, and this is why I wanted to read that story is going to parallel very closely with a story years later, when instead of Jacob deceiving his dad, his sons deceive him. So let's pick up the story. Now Joseph came to his brothers. They stripped him of his robe, the ornate robe he was wearing. They took him and they threw him into the cistern. The cistern was empty. There was no water in it. We talked about this last week. And as they sat down to eat their meal, they looked up and they saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead. The camels were loaded with spices, balm, myrrh. So they went and they were on their way to take them down to Egypt. Judah said to his brothers, "What will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him. After all, he's our brother, our own flesh and blood." And his brothers agreed. So when the Midianite merchants came by, his brothers pulled Joseph up out of the cistern, sold him for 20 shekels of silver to the Ishmaelites who took him to Egypt. And they sat down to eat their meal. Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, I went back here. So when the Midianite, I thought I deleted all these earlier. So they got Joseph's robe. They slaughtered a goat. Deja vu. Dipped the robe in blood. They took the ornate robe back to their father and said, "We found this. Examine it to see whether it's your son's robe." He recognized it. And he said, "It is my son's robe. Some ferocious animal has devoured him. Joseph has surely been torn to pieces." Now, notice, the brothers never said that. Then Jacob tore his clothes. He put on sackcloth and mourned for his son many days. All his sons and daughters came to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. "No," he said, "I'll continue to mourn until I join my son in the grave." So his father wept for him. Meanwhile, the Midianites sold Joseph in Egypt to Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard. When we read this story, there's so much I think we miss. And so I want to walk you through it maybe with a little bit different insight. So some of this is from kind of what we know from Egypt history of the time. Some of it's from Hebrew history. Some of it, but the Bible is kind of the skeleton on which we hang everything. So let me walk you through the story. Joseph, with his coat of many colors, comes up to see his brothers. They see him afar off and they say, let's kill him. Let's kill him. So as he gets closer, Reuben, who's the oldest brother, says, no, we don't want to kill him because we've shed enough blood. So let's just throw him in a cistern for now. Or let's just not kill him. Let's just teach him a lesson. So they strip him of his robe. Now, what this probably means is it's the inner garment, okay, that Joseph would have been wearing. Just like us, there's kind of like, we have like 3 layers, particularly this time of year. You have your underwear, then you have your clothes that you're wearing, whether it be a dress or shirt and pants. Then you have a coat, whether it be your jacket that's hanging out in the lobby. You have like, they had much the same thing in this culture. So many people believe, there's some people believe that outer garment was actually the coat of many colors, but when you really look at it, it was probably that inner garment. Normally, that was kind of your work clothes kind of thing, particularly if you were a shepherd, particularly if you were out in the agriculture area. I mean, you think about it for a minute. You know, you have a different set of clothes if you're hanging around the house. If you're going to work, you have if I'm going to go out and work on the farm or in the shed, like yesterday when I went out to work in the shed, I had on my jeans and a t-shirt. I'm not going to put on dress pants and a dress shirt. So the brothers are wearing work clothes. The coat of many colors is Sunday best. And it's Sunday best that Daddy gave to you because you're Daddy's favorite. And it became a source of irritation for the brothers. So they take his coat off of him and they grab his outside clothes, so to speak, and basically the kid's in his underwear. He's 17 years old. They take him, and I believe that at this point, Reuben leaves. He's the oldest. Reuben is not, I don't believe Reuben is there when this next event takes place. But they take Joseph in his underwear and they throw him into this pit. Now, it probably wasn't super deep. It was probably 17 feet or so, would have had kind of a muddy bottom because it had held water, but this cistern was dry. So he's at the bottom, maybe, again, 15, 17 feet, something like that. And he starts crying out to his brothers, okay, guys, it's not funny anymore. Hey, guys, let me out. Hey, guys, what you're doing is not right. Guys, I'm going to tell Dad. And the more he cries out, the more they ignore him. And at some point, they leave that cistern pit area and go over and sit down to have lunch or supper. And Joseph still stays in the pit, screaming, crying out to be helped. And as he cries out and he cries out, they get far enough away that they don't have to listen to it anymore. They can hear, let him cry all he wants. From his world, he thinks they're still outside the cistern. He doesn't know. They don't care. They're sitting off on the side eating lunch, and they see in the distance a caravan coming by. A bunch of Ishmaelites, Midianites. And so as they start to go by, because they're on a trade route, so as they start to go by, they wave them over. So the guy comes over, and there's a whole caravan of camels and carts and everything else. And the lead guy, the guy in charge, gets down off of his camel. And they start talking about what they're doing. They say, well, we're on our way to Egypt. We have spices and things like that. And we're going to go to the flea market down there, and we're going to sell our wares and make our money, and then we're going to come back. And the brothers come up with an idea. Why don't we sell Joseph? So they start talking. They say, are you interested in a slave? What do you mean, are we interested in slaves? Now again, these guys were merchants. Any way to make a buck. So they start thinking, and they say, well, I don't know. What do you have in mind? We got a guy in the pit over here. Let's see him. So they come over to the pit, and they throw a rope down, and they say, Joseph, you grab on the rope, we're going to pull you up. Oh, good. You guys finally come to your senses. And they pull Joseph up out of the pit, and as he gets out of the pit and he starts to talk to his brother, they grab his hands and they bind them. So he's standing there now with his hands bound. Okay, guys, this isn't funny. And he notices there's a whole caravan of Midianites and Ishmaelites. And as he stands there and looks at them, he watches them talk. And the head Midianite guy comes up and he starts grabbing him, feeling the muscles. Again, remember, Daddy had protected him. So he doesn't quite look like, and he doesn't quite feel like his brothers who have spent all the time out in the wilderness. And the Midianites start looking and sizing him up and looking at him. Joseph is not, he has no clue what's going on. So he goes back over, and the guy goes to his camel, and he pulls the thing out of his bag, and he pulls out his old money change purse, and he gives him 20 shekels of silver. Now, at this time, normally, a price slave was 40 shekels. But again, he's only 17 years old, and you know what? He's really not built for this hard stuff anyway. He's kind of soft. So the next thing you know, they take Joseph, and the guy starts pushing him over towards him, and they have a camel that gets down, and they put Joseph on the camel, and his hands are still bound. And then the Midianite, Ishmaelite procession gets up, and they start marching off. They start riding towards Egypt, and Joseph is pleading with his brothers. Hey, guys, this isn't funny. Come on, guys, don't do this to me. Guys, you can't do this to me. I'm your brother. And as they continue on, he looks back, and his brothers and all of their animals get farther and farther and farther away. And the brothers sit down to eat and decide who's going to get what from the 20 shekels of money that we got. Meanwhile, as they're sitting there having lunch, Reuben comes back. And the first thing that Reuben does is stick his head in the cistern. And he realizes Joseph's not there. So he comes to his brothers. He goes, what happened to Joseph? You guys thinking maybe they killed him. And they're like, no, you need to go. We made money off this deal. There was a caravan that came along. We sold him. We got 20 shekels. Look at this. We can split it all up. You know that trip you wanted to take? You can take it now. You know, an extra camel you wanted to buy, you could buy it now. And he looks at his brothers, he goes, do you understand? What have you done to me? Because Joseph was his ticket back to daddy. Joseph was his way. He was going to bring Joseph out of the pit when his brothers weren't looking and take him to his dad and go, see, Dad, I saved your son. Because Reuben was on the outs with Dad because he had taken one of Dad's concubines, and he should have been killed, but instead he was trying to make up for that. And so he thought, maybe Joseph was my ticket. And he looks at his brothers, he goes, now what am I going to do? His brother said, I got an idea. Let's take his coat and let's tear it. Let's start shredding a little bit. Let's go take one of those goats that we're watching. Let's kill it. Let's smear it in blood. I'll send it back to Dad. So they hatched this plan. They start making their way back towards Dad, and they come up with this idea that, you know what, here's what we're going to do. Let's send a messenger ahead, because Dad, there's going to be too many questions about us if we bring this into Dad. Let's send a messenger ahead of time. So they send a messenger and say, here's what we want you to do. We want you to take this coat, and we want you to walk it in, and we want you to show it to Dad. And when Dad asks about it, you can just tell him, we found this on the side of a hillside, and we don't know anything about it. So this messenger goes ahead of him, and he gets to Jacob's tent door and knocks. I don't know how you knock on a tent door. Foo, foo, foo. Knocks on a tent door. And he's got this robe, this multicolored robe, and it's all shredded up, and it's got blood on it. And he walks in, and Jacob sees that robe and knows immediately. And he starts to look at it, and as he comes closer, he brings it up. He goes, what happened? He says, I don't know. Your brothers told me to bring this to you. They're on their way, but they're not here yet. My brothers told me to bring this to you. They found it on a hillside. Do you recognize it? They think they know whose it is. His dad looks at it, and he starts to weep. And he starts to cry, and he starts to break down. And eventually the boys come in. And when the boys get there, they start sending people in to try to ease his comfort and his pain. And Jacob is just devastated. I mean, he's already lost Rachel, his favorite wife. Now his favorite son is gone. And he's just devastated by it. And they try everything they know how to do to get him to start to process the grief. But he refuses. And he says, I'm going to go to my grave this way. In fact, 13 years later when we're in Egypt, and this whole story starts to unfold, even then the brothers are still realizing Dad is still grieving the loss of Joseph. And they realize, you know what? Maybe we went too far. But there's nothing they can do about it now. Meanwhile, there's Joseph. Joseph has now got his hands bound, and he's on this camel as they ride towards Egypt. They come to a place where they decide to camp for the night. So they take and they set up their tents, and they take Joseph off of his camel, and they set him over down by a tree. He's still bound watching them, and they sit and they get their tents all set up, and then they have a meal and they eat. They bring Joseph over some of the leftovers to give him some water, and he's sitting there all by himself, while all of these Ishmaelites and Midianites, as they have their tents and they get ready for the night, and it's starting to get cold, and remember, he's still in his underwear. So they come over to Joseph. One of them comes over to Joseph, and he unbinds his hands. And for the first time, Joseph has his hands unbound since this whole thing started. They go over and they find an old coat that they can put on him so he can stay warm that night. And they put the coat on. It's not like the coat of many colors. It's not like the garments that he had before. It's rough, it's old, it's been battered and beaten. It's a second-hand deal. And they put it on Joseph, and then they say, give us your hands again. And he puts his hands back out, and they bind them. And it's that night, they go into their tents. And Joseph is sitting there beside a tree, and he falls asleep that night in the cold night without a fire, all alone. You see, up until now, he'd always slept in a house. He wasn't like his brothers who had been out on the hillside, who had been out with the sheep. Joseph's not prepared for this. Joseph's not ready for this. So he sleeps out that night, maybe for the first time, maybe for the 10th or 11th, but never unprepared like he is now. They get up the next morning and they have breakfast and they pack up the tents and they take Joseph and they put him on the camel and they head down to Egypt. And this goes on for almost 2 weeks. Every day the same thing. As they keep going further, the land is starting to change now. Everything's starting to look different. It's not looking like home used to be anymore. So as Joseph starts getting closer and closer to Egypt, finally, they get on the outskirts of Egypt, and off in the distance comes a chariot. It's a small group, but they can see the dust kicking up, and they can see the reflection of all of the armor and all of the gold and all of the brass and all the silver. And this chariot comes up, and a guy jumps off the chariot. And he stops the caravan, and he says, "What are you guys doing?" Kind of the TSA of the day. He's now going to go through all of their stuff because he wants to make sure you're not going to carry any contraband into our country. So they start pulling off some of the bags and making sure they have spices and making sure they have what they said they had. And they said, "Look, we're just heading to the flea market. We're going to sell our stuff and we'll come back. That's what we're here for." And as he's looking at all the stuff, he comes to this little kid, 17-year-old kid sitting on a camel. He said, "Who's this?" He's a foreigner. He doesn't look like anybody in that group, and he doesn't look like anybody from Egypt. So he starts looking at this kid, and they say, "Well, he's a slave. We bought him. We're going to sell him when we're down there." So they check him out a little bit more, and finally they let him pass. Then they come to an area that's outside of Egypt, and there's a market area, and everybody's got goods and wares all set up. So they've got their stuff set up, and they're negotiating for spices and all of this kind of thing. And as they're negotiating, all of a sudden, there's somebody who looks really different. Now, this guy is dressed differently than everybody else in that marketplace. You can tell this guy's special. His armor is better than anybody's. He stands differently than anybody. His sword is different than anybody's there. And you can tell, not only is he important, but he's got money. And so he comes up and he starts asking these guys about that kid. See, he's a captain of the guard, so he understands that it helps to have people from different nationalities. And Joseph realizes he's in a strange land because as they start, he saw a river that had boats on it. He's never seen anything like that before. And as he's sitting there, everybody around him speaking a language that he doesn't understand, everybody looks different from him. He's really the odd guy out. And this guy starts negotiating back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And finally, the guy goes over and he checks Joseph out and he grabs him. He gets him to try to talk, even though they can't understand each other. So finally, he says, the captain of the guard negotiates, and he hands the Midianites some money. And he says, again, they can't communicate, so you come here. He goes over, and there's a cart that he has brought wares to get rid of there at the market. They had extra hogs or extra whatever, and so they had sold them at the market. So he's got this empty cart. He's picked up a couple of other slaves, and he throws them into the back of the cart. And again, Joseph's hands are bound. He's now in the back of the cart as they start to make their way through. And Joseph starts to see things he's never seen before. All of a sudden, they're on a road that's somewhat paved. It's all rock. And he starts to go past statues that are massive, of heads of different animals and bodies of different animals. And he starts to see all of these things. And he's bound as he's riding in the back of that cart. And then, as if that's not enough, he comes to an area where he looks off and just over around the corner. He sees a bunch of people cutting block and stacking it. And there's a guy with a whip in his hand who's beating them and yelling at them and telling them what to do. And he's sitting there thinking, that's going to be my world now. I'm a slave. They continue to ride, and as they get outside, all of a sudden they come into an area where this is different than anything he's seen before. It's immaculate. The fences, the stone fences are perfect. The vineyards are perfectly lined up. The fields, he's noticed, you can look at the field, there's not a weed in it. And he sees people working in those fields. He sees people working in those vineyards. And they go down this long road and they come to this massive, beautiful house. And it stops. And they open the back of the cart and they get Joseph and the other guys out. And the first thing that he does is he cuts the bindings. And for the first time, Joseph's hands are free. So they're stiff, and he starts to work them, and they motion for him to sit down. So he goes over and sits down. Sits down under a shade tree. The next thing he knows, somebody walks over to him with a goat flask full of water, and they give it to him to drink. So the first time, he's been able to drink as much as he wants. They walk over with bowls, and probably 2 bowls, but think of it in the terms of its oatmeal and lentils and things like that. So they hand him this bowl for the first time. He's not eating leftovers. He shovels as much in his mouth as he could. I mean, this is the first time he's had a meal. And they treat him very nice. And then, as it comes to the sun starts to set that night, he notices there's a sound, and everybody all of a sudden bows in the same direction. They start chanting things because nobody there speaks his language. Nobody there worships his God. Nobody there is anything that he can relate to. And as he sits there as a 17-year-old kid whose world has been turned upside down with no hope, he will never, ever go back to Israel. This is going to be his new home in which he will ultimately die. And this 17-year-old kid sits there. And then they come to him. And again, he set off from everybody else because everybody else could talk. They knew the language. They could interact with them themselves. Nobody knew his language. Probably why he had been bought. And he sits there and they come to him and they say, "Follow us." They take the other guys and they put them in a room with all together because they could speak the same language. They talk to, and they bring Joseph and they say, and they basically point him into this little bitty room, little bitty hut, so to speak. And he walks in there and there's a mat on the floor. And basically for the first time, Joseph sleeps inside. And as he puts his head on his mat on that dirt floor in a foreign land, surrounded by foreign people, for the first time, he realizes, this is my new world. And there is nothing that he has but his God. And he puts his head on that mat that night, realizing he's not in Israel anymore. I tell you that story in those terms for us to maybe think a little bit differently. When we read a passage that says, meanwhile, Joseph was sold to the captain of the guard in Egypt at Potiphar's house. See, sometimes we take these Bible stories and we don't realize these are real people who are experiencing real emotions, who are experiencing real difficulties. And for a 17-year-old kid to be put in that situation, do you understand how easy it would be to get angry with God? Do you understand how easy it would be to say, all that stuff my dad told me was a bunch of baloney, it doesn't matter. If that God really loved me, why would he be doing all of this stuff to me? Why would my brothers have treated me the way they would? You understand the mindset that he could go down? 2 lessons this morning for us this week. First lesson from Jacob. You reap what you sow. Jacob deceived his dad with goat skin and trying to be something that was not, so he could take something from his brother. It cost him all kinds of relationships. Cost him a relationship with his mom, with his brother, with his dad. He never learned. And you find his sons doing the very same thing to him years later. Please understand this. If you don't break the cycle, you'll repeat the cycle. If you don't break it, you'll repeat it. You reap what you sow. When I deal with couples and we're dealing with marriage counseling, one of the things that we always talk about is this idea of, I said, I want you to pick a couple of things from your parents' marriage that you want to bring into yours. If you don't do this intentionally, then you're going to get yourself in trouble. Because even the good things you have to work at. And then I tell them, now I want you to pick a couple things from your parents' marriage that you don't want to bring into your marriage. Because if you don't break the cycle, you will repeat it. By default. In the world of psychology, we call it family of origin. And it repeats, cycles repeat over. It's a reason children of alcoholics become alcoholics. Because they don't intentionally make an effort to change things. They just assume that because they don't want to go that route, they won't go that route. And that's not the way it works. And so I want to challenge you to sit back and go, maybe there's some things in my life right now I need to change while I can. Change it. The second lesson, I think, is a lesson that applies to all of us. And that's this. Where was God in the life of Joseph? Every step of the way. Every step of the way. God was with him in the pit. God was with him on the camel. God was with him when he was sitting outside in his underwear. God was with him when they sold him into slavery. God was with him. I mean, think about this. Think of all the things that could have changed the dynamic of this story. Had the Midianites not passed by, had the brothers killed him, had the Midianites said, 20 shekels of silver is too much, I'm going to go find a better deal. Had the captain of the guard walked by and not noticed Joseph, had he not been sold to the captain of the guard, had somebody else gotten there before and cut a deal earlier, all the things that could have happened. But here's what you need to understand. God's fingerprint is on every step of the journey. Now listen to me this morning. God's fingerprint is on every step of your journey as well. But God, I don't understand. Yeah, Joseph could have said that and probably did from time to time. But here's what Joseph does. Joseph decides he's going to trust God and he's going to follow God no matter what. In the pit, on the camel, at Potiphar's household, no matter what, I'm going to follow God. You say, but it's easy for Joseph because Joseph ends up, no, you don't understand. We look at it as saying it's easy for Joseph. If you're a 17-year-old boy going through what I just told you this morning, believe me, you're going to have a really hard time seeing God in the middle of all that. And for some of you, what's happening in your life right now is there's so much that's coming overwhelming to you, and you can't see God in it. Here's what I'm here to tell you this morning. God's fingerprints are all over your life. You've got to continue to trust Him. Because in the end, everything that happened here is a step towards where God ultimately has him in Egypt. And all of history is affected by this. And that's what challenge, because I think sometimes we forget this. We get so caught up in what we're going through that we lose perspective. And I want to challenge you this morning with this idea that whatever you're going through, you need to understand this. God loves you so much. And He has a plan and a purpose for everything you're going through in your life, and His fingerprints are all over your life. You may or may not see them. I don't know. Sometimes God lets you see it, and sometimes He doesn't. I come back to us coming to this church, and I can take it down to a 24-hour period that would have dramatically changed the course of everything in my life. 24 hours. But God's hand was on every step of the way. We can tell you story after story after story of this ministry and how God has done things. There are people in here who could stand on this platform for the rest of the day and share with you God's hand in their life through things that they never saw. And there are people who could stand on this platform and say, I don't have a clue what God is doing. All I know is I'm mad right now, and it's hard, and I don't know how I can keep going on. And what I would say to you is, keep going on. Because this world is short, and God works in eternity. And you may never know on this side of the grave what God's plan is for you. But I'm here to tell you, as long as you're faithful, as long as you stick with Him, as long as you continue to trust Him, He will take, and just like He does in the life of Joseph, He will use you in ways you cannot imagine. A lot of it will depend on how you respond. Joseph could have gone a lot of different ways in this story. But at the end of the time, when we get to the end of Genesis, when we talk about his conclusion, you know what he says? All that stuff, you meant it for evil. But God, He used it for good. And that's ultimately our prayer. It's what Paul says to the Roman people. That God works in incredible ways that way. So, I end this morning with this. Joseph's journey to Egypt reminds us that God's in control. He orchestrates the smallest of details to accomplish His purposes. Jacob teaches us that we'll reap what we sow. So we've got to make changes now and sow the right thing. This week, be sensitive to God's work in your life and respond by trusting Him. Let's pray. Lord, help us. Again, easy to say and easy to do when things go well, but hard to do, Lord, when things come into our lives that we don't understand. Lord, may we be like Joseph in the way that we determined that no matter what, we are going to trust You, and we're going to serve You, and we're going to walk and honor You in everything we do, regardless of our circumstances. And when it's all said and done, Lord, may You be honored and glorified. May people see You in us. These things we ask in Your name. Amen. Let's stand together. We're going to sing.